The room is small, low-ceilinged, lined with maps that no longer match the world. A clock ticks in the corner, the sound too loud for the number of people standing there. A telephone rings, one short, metallic trill, and the young officer closest to it answers, pencil poised above a blotter blackened with old notes. He listens, nods, writes a single word, capitularen. Surrender. A breath leaves the room as if the building itself has exhaled. Outside, Berlin is burning. Inside, history is reshaping itself around a sentence. Hours later, on another continent, a mother in a factory town puts down her welding torch and leans into a radio. The announcer's voice trembles. People fall silent between the conveyor belts. On the street, someone shouts from a second-floor window that the war in Europe is over, and for a second no one responds, because words that large need space before they can land. Then the sound rises, doors opening, horns on cars, a church bell somewhere finding its note. The news ricochets across a battered planet, victory in Europe. VE Day. It is the spring of 1945. 6 years of total war have consumed factories and farms, cities, and children. 27 million dead in the Soviet Union. 6 million Jews murdered. A continent of displaced people moving in no fixed direction. The map of Europe has become a palimpsest, every new line written over another line made only months before. And now, a day to anchor the chaos, May 8th for London and Paris and Washington, May 9th for Moscow. The fighting in the Pacific continues, but on this front, the guns are finally falling quiet. Kindly comment, like, share, and subscribe for the next episode. To understand how a single day can carry that much weight, step back to the beginning. September 1939, German troops cross into Poland with a doctrine of speed and shock. Britain and France declare war, but their armies wait behind old fortifications while the Wehrmacht develops a grim rhythm: airfields first, then rail, then roads, then cities. By June 1940, France has fallen. By autumn, the Blitz is carving London into hammered metal. In the East, the Soviet Union absorbs its first blows and then, in 1941, receives the full force of Operation Barbarossa. The front becomes a wound thousands of miles long. Allied grand strategy unfolds unevenly. North Africa, Sicily, Italy. Bombers climb into the English sky every night, droning toward the Ruhr, Hamburg, Berlin. Factories of war spin furiously in Detroit, Newcastle, Magnitogorsk. In June 1944, waves of men and machines begin to cross the channel. D-Day plants a seed that will grow into the end of Hitler's Reich. Yet even after the beachheads hold, the war refuses to resolve into a clean narrative. Autumn brings the Ardennes and the surprise of the Bulge, forests etched with snow, Americans clinging to crossroads, German tanks running on fumes and wishful orders. The offensive fails. The Allies cross the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army pushes across the Vistula, the Oder, the suburbs of Berlin. An anvil and a hammer closing. By April 1945, Berlin is surrounded, and the dictatorship has shrunk to a bunker and the imagination of its leader. The city becomes a maze of shattered apartments and makeshift barricades. Men too young and men too old are given anti-tank weapons and ordered to hold streets that no longer exist. Soviet artillery turns avenues into dust. In the bunker, Adolf Hitler dictates a political testament to a world that has stopped listening and then kills himself. Joseph Goebbels follows. What remains is not ideology but paperwork, the shape and timing of a surrender. That paperwork does not write itself. Here lies the tension, the friction that makes the moment real rather than inevitable. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union have different priorities, different definitions of how a regime should die. The Germans, under Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, want one thing above all: to keep their soldiers from falling into Soviet hands. They try to thread a needle, laying down arms in the West while fighting on in the East long enough to move divisions, refugees, anyone who can still run, away from the Red Army. It is not a plan, it is an instinct for self-preservation masquerading as policy. At the Allied headquarters in Reims, France, General Dwight Eisenhower and his staff wear the fatigue of April like a second uniform. The phone lines carry contradictory signals. German emissaries probe for any arrangement short of total capitulation. The Soviet leadership demands a single, unequivocal instrument of surrender signed in the capital where the war began and where it has ended, Berlin.
Eisenhower insists on unconditional surrender across all fronts.
No partial measures, no time extensions, no coastlines still mined with last-minute clauses. The message to the German command is blunt: sign, or the war continues and the lines harden against you.
So the drama moves into rooms with long tables and harsh lighting.
On May 7, at 2:41 a.m., inside a red brick schoolhouse repurposed as the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Alfred Jodl signs a document that is as brief as it is total. All German forces will cease operations at 23:01 Central European Time on May 8. The room is so quiet that the scratching of pens sounds louder than the words themselves. Eisenhower is not present. His deputy, Walter Bedell Smith, accepts the signature. A Soviet general, Ivan Sesloparov, signs as a witness but not as the representative of Stalin's command. This, the Soviet leader argues, will not do.
There is a second ceremony, demanded by Moscow to complete the symbolism and the legality.
In a ruined city lit by floodlights and bonfires, at a military engineering school in the Karlshorst district, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signs more documents late on May 8, already the early minutes of May 9 in Moscow. This time, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov presides. This time, no one disputes the framework or the meaning.
The languages multiply on paper, but the substance remains the same: unconditional. The war in Europe is over. Between these signatures and the hour when guns actually fall silent, chaos persists.
Communications lines are broken. Pockets of resistance misunderstand or pretend to misunderstand orders. In Prague, a city in revolt, fighting rages until the last hours. In the north, German troops surrender in Norway, the last garrison in the open. In the Baltics and the Courland Pocket, German units lay down arms after long delay. On the Channel Islands, German officers read the news with faces that have forgotten how to register relief. There are final skirmishes that should not have happened. Lives end in the minutes before the ceasefire, seconds left on the clock that no longer counts. And then, at last, the day arrives. In London, crowds graze against one another like a tide pressing up Whitehall to Buckingham Palace. Winston Churchill appears on a balcony, cigar lifted, making the famous V with his fingers, a letter that suddenly belongs to the public as much as to any politician. The royal family steps into the light: the king, the queen, the two princesses who will slip into the crowds later and wander anonymously through scenes of joy they will never forget. Fog gathers in the lower streets, and the city lights itself from within. People climb statues, dance in squares, kiss strangers. In Paris, the boulevards are a film reel of flags and flowers. In New York, Times Square surges and swirls until the streets are almost solid. Boys in uniform are held tight and then released into the noise. A sailor buys a bottle of soda, takes one sip, and hands it to a child he doesn't know. The cork pops into the air and disappears. Yet celebration sits near grief, and one is not a rebuttal of the other. Not all faces are turned upward in those photographs. There are missing chairs at kitchen tables, telegrams folded into drawers, letters that came back stamped undeliverable. In the East, the Soviet Union marks the victory with a gravity born of scale: cities leveled, an entire generation remade. In Warsaw there is relief edged with the knowledge that liberation has arrived wrapped in a new political order. In Berlin, the streets are an inventory of ruins. Among the winners and the losers, the living and the dead, one truth insists on recognition: Europe has not so much ended a war as opened a long corridor of consequences. The immediate aftermath is logistical before it is philosophical. Millions of refugees move across burned-out rail lines and broken roads. Displaced persons camps spring up, cities inside tents and barracks, languages braided together under tarps. Allied military governments take shape in zones: American, British, French in the West, Soviet in the East. Trains carry liberated prisoners and slave laborers homeward. Others. Jews who survived ghettos and camps, people who cannot or will not return to towns where neighbors were once collaborators, move toward the future with no clear sense of where future lies. The crimes of the regime come fully to light. Photographs from Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Majdanek, and hundreds of other places reach an audience that thought it knew what the word atrocity meant. The shock is moral and it is practical: the living need food, the dead need names. Journalists walk through rooms of shaved hair, crates of spectacles, bundles of shoes. Soldiers who have seen combat every day for months turn away and vomit quietly against walls.
In that confrontation, VE Day acquires a second meaning.
It is not only victory over armies, it is victory over a system that industrialized murder.
Politics does not pause. The alliance that crushed Nazi Germany begins to harden into two camps.
In the unease of 1945, years are already foreshadowed: Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946, the Berlin airlift in 1948-49, a division of Europe that will take a lifetime to thaw.
The seeds of future unions are also sown.
The United Nations opens in San Francisco that spring, shaped by hopes born from catastrophe.
In Western Europe, early plans for economic cooperation, later the Coal and Steel Community, then the European Economic Community, grow from a single question: how can a continent that has tried to destroy itself twice in a generation be rearranged so that it cannot do so again? For the men and women who lived through it, the legacy is counted less in treaties than in private reckonings. A veteran waking into silence for the first time in years, startled by a car exhaust that sounds like artillery and then ashamed of the fear. A nurse taking off her shoes and sleeping for 18 hours on a hospital cot. A mother unfolding a newspaper to see the word victory stretched across the top, feeling the bottomless absence of a son who should have been there to read it. Two princesses walking into a London night, anonymous only for a few hours, absorbing the collective heartbeat.
A Soviet infantryman writing a postcard from a foreign capital to a village that may no longer exist. In those lies, VE Day is not a paragraph, it is a pivot.
Time recasts the day according to where you stand.
In much of Western Europe and North America, May 8th is a bookend, a relief that frames the war's narrative. In Russia and parts of the former Soviet Union, May 9th carries a different gravity, the Great Patriotic War ending in a holiday that is both grief and pride, more like a national memorial than a victory parade. In countries caught between Hitler and Stalin, Poland, the Baltics, others, the word liberation is a debate, an acknowledgement that one occupation ended as another began.
70, 80 years later, the politics of memory remains an active front. Even the final day has shadows.
On May 8th, violence did not disappear, it shifted. Some acts of revenge were immediate and vicious. Some war criminals slipped through the cracks and reappeared years later under new names in new towns. In the ruins, black markets blossomed while children scavenged bricks from collapsed walls.
Armies disbanded, then reorganized as occupiers, families reassembled with more gaps than people.
The work of dismantling the machinery of a totalitarian state, the legal codes, the textbooks, the military schools, the police headquarters, began the morning after the cheers.
And yet, even with all the ambiguities acknowledged, VE Day retains its core.
It marks the moment when people could imagine, not just plead for, a Europe without Hitler's terror. For millions, that was freedom enough to justify dancing in the streets. For countless others, it was a pause between tragedies, a day of no fighting here while elsewhere the war ground on against Japan.
Both readings can be true. History is capacious enough to hold celebration and exhaustion in the same frame. How did the war end, practically speaking?
With signatures on paper and men who enforced them. With commanders sending couriers down corridors lit by blackout lamps, with code clerks punching new messages into machines that had carried death for years. With junior officers who refused to let their divisions vanish in the minutes before midnight, with soldiers who were ready, even then, to fire if told to fire. It ended because enough people in power chose an end and because those who had done the killing were ordered to stop.
What did it change? Everything visible and much that is invisible.
The borders on maps, the motives in constitutions, the stories families tell children about who they are. It created a Europe that would live with American troops in its towns and Soviet troops in its capitals, a world that would build washing machines and rockets and nuclear weapons under the same roof. It made possible the trials at Nuremberg and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
It left behind cemeteries in Normandy and Volgograd, crosses and stars of David lined so neatly they look almost like fields from a distance.
It did not repair what was broken, it marked the day when repair could begin.
80 years on, the distance is deceptive. The photographs are monochrome, but the human story hasn't dimmed. Diaries still emerge from attics, letters keep being found in false bottom drawers. Family myths dissolve into documented truths.
The child who kissed the sailor in the square grew old, told the story to a granddaughter, and then, one day, stopped telling it because she ran out of days.
Museums add new names to plaques. Governments recalibrate parades. Historians argue over numbers and over nuance, and, as they do, the public rehearses the tighter questions. What would I have done? What am I doing now that will seem as stark to someone looking back?
On anniversaries, survivors used to gather in shrinking circles. They would stand a little apart from the pageantry and hold each other's hands. The words were simple and not for microphones. I made it.
You made it. He didn't. She didn't. As the years pass, the living witnesses are fewer, and we rely on records, voices on tape, film reels, the powdered scent of ink on archival paper.
Memory becomes an institution, which is both a blessing and a risk.
Institutions can preserve, they can also flatten. The task is to keep the human edge sharp. So what does VE Day ask of anyone hearing the story now?
To resist the comfort of tidy endings. To keep both images in view, the kissing couples and the trains of displaced people, the balcony wave and the Mort warehouse of personal effects. To notice that victory, even when justified, leaves problems that need more than triumph to solve.
To understand that the promise of peace after a total war is not self-executing.
It is built, one decision at a time, by people who choose not to repeat what they have learned the hard way. Close your eyes and return to that first room, the one with the maps and the clock. The officer with the pencil hears the line go dead and keeps his hand on the receiver for a second longer than necessary, as if reluctant to let the sound end. Around him, colleagues begin to move, slowly at first and then with purpose.
Orders must be typed, couriers dispatched, signals sent, and resent across a continent.
The officer raises his head. For the first time in years, the following sentence is permitted, even if he doesn't quite know how to think it yet. This is after. Outside, Berlin burns less brightly as dawn approaches.
Across the channel, London wakes into a day it will remember forever.
In Paris, someone tapes a paper sign to a bakery window, pain aujourd'hui, and below it, a smaller line, Victoire.
In Moscow, the night will turn to day while the signing pens still scratch.
In a factory town half a world away, a mother sets down her welding mask and counts minutes until her son walks through the door, not because she believes in miracles but because on this day belief feels less like madness.
Victory in Europe.
A date on a calendar, a headline, a cheer that went up like sparks and drifted, and did not go out. The work afterwards was long and imperfect, and it remains unfinished. But the meaning of that day, 8 decades on, is still strong enough to hold in the mouth like a solid thing.
A war ended. A chance began.
And in that narrow passage between past and future, people stood in streets under unfamiliar light and, for a few hours, let themselves look up.